a sudden encounter. It was a night that seemed to stretch endlessly. The rain poured from the heavens in torrents, pounding against the windshield of Officer Isaac Henry's police cruiser as he navigated through the slick, empty streets of Westbridge. He had been on the force for over 10 years, and no matter how many rainy nights he spent on patrol, he never grew used to the eerie calm that followed a storm. It was as if the whole city had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Henry, however, had long since learned how to embrace the quiet. He knew that, as a police officer, his job was not just to respond to the loud, chaotic calls but also to watch over the smaller, quieter moments, those when people needed help the most but had no one to turn to. His radio crackled with static, a reminder that his shift had only just begun. He wasn't expecting anything unusual, just the usual minor incidents and routine calls. At 40, he had seen everything from petty thefts to more dangerous situations. But tonight, the city seemed particularly still. The hum of the cruiser's engine was the only sound keeping him company. The road before him stretched out like a ribbon in the dark, streetlights casting faint halos in the downpour. Henry slowed down as he neared a narrow side street. He always made it a habit to keep his eyes peeled, scanning the sidewalks for any signs of danger or distress. His eyes were drawn to a small figure standing alone at the edge of the curb. The boy's small frame was almost invisible against the backdrop of the rain, his clothes soaked through, clinging to his skin. Henry's attention snapped to him immediately. This wasn't something he saw every day. The boy, no older than 13, was struggling. His arms were stretched out, one cradling a small child while the other clutched another toddler tightly against his chest. Both children were wriggling uncomfortably, their faces wet with tears, their tiny bodies trembling from the cold. The boy's face, though youthful, was set with a level of determination that struck Henry immediately. For a brief moment, Henry wondered if the boy was just waiting for someone. But as he watched, it became clear this wasn't the case. The boy wasn't just holding the children, he was holding them together, keeping them close, trying to shield them from the storm in a way that a parent might. His gaze was fixed firmly on the toddlers, his attention completely absorbed by them. Henry felt a jolt of instinctive urgency. The boy was alone in the rain with two children who couldn't have been older than 2 or 3. This wasn't something that should be happening on his watch, especially not on a night like this. Without hesitation, Henry brought his cruiser to a stop. The tires screeched faintly against the wet asphalt as he parked on the side of the road. He grabbed the mic and spoke into it. "Central, this is Officer Henry. I've got a potential welfare check on a child and 2 toddlers. I'll need backup to assist. Over." There was a brief pause on the other end before the dispatcher acknowledged the request. But Henry's attention was already back on the boy. The rain didn't show any sign of letting up, and the boy's thin frame was struggling against the elements. He couldn't just sit in the car and wait for backup. This was a situation that required immediate action. Henry rolled down the window of his cruiser, sticking his head out into the pouring rain. "Hey, kid," he called. "You need a place to stay out of the rain?" The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide and startled. He looked over his shoulder, as if debating whether to approach the stranger or not. His hands tightened around the toddlers, holding them closer, as if afraid someone might take them from him. Henry softened his tone, not wanting to scare him away. "I've got a car here, kid. You and the little ones can stay dry until we figure out what's going on. It's too dangerous to be out here like this." The boy's gaze flickered from Henry to the toddlers, then back to him. A brief flicker of doubt passed across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the same determined expression. Without another word, he stepped forward, clutching the toddlers tightly in his arms, and climbed into the back seat of the cruiser. Henry didn't waste a second. He immediately drove off, the sound of the tires spinning through the rain mingling with the soft cries of the children in the back seat. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. The boy, who had barely said a word, was holding the children with such a quiet intensity that Henry could tell there was a deeper connection. But why was the boy out here with them? Where were their parents? How had they ended up in the middle of a storm, all alone? Trying to break the silence, Henry spoke to the boy, his voice gentle. "You okay, kid? You want to tell me your name?" The boy didn't respond, his eyes focused on the toddlers, whose sobs had slowly quieted. Henry sighed, realizing that trying to get information out of the boy wasn't going to be easy. He would have to wait for the right moment, for the boy to trust him enough to open up. After a few more minutes of driving, Henry's mind was racing with possibilities. As much as he wanted to help, he had a feeling that things were not as simple as they seemed. The city's streets were empty now, and his cruiser was the only vehicle on the road. There was a hollow quiet about the entire situation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. At the station, Henry pulled into the parking lot and parked near the entrance. He immediately opened the door to help the boy and the toddlers out. He couldn't help but notice how the boy, despite being so young, had a certain grace in his movements. He was careful with the children, never once fumbling or seeming uncertain. There was a calmness in him that seemed out of place for a kid his age. Once inside the station, Henry quickly helped the boy settle into a chair in the waiting area. The toddlers, still drowsy from exhaustion, sat in a stroller Henry had found in the Lost and Found. He wrapped them both in blankets, their small faces pale from the cold. He then placed a call to his supervisor, explaining the situation and asking for immediate assistance with identifying the boy and his siblings. As the minutes passed, Henry kept an eye on the boy. His mind raced with unanswered questions. Why wouldn't Mason speak? Where had they come from? And most importantly, where was their family? Suddenly, the door to the station opened with a sudden rush of wind. A man, looking to be in his 50s, hurried inside, his eyes scanning the room frantically. His gaze fixed on Mason immediately. "Mason," the man called out, his voice thick with emotion. "Where are they? Are they okay?" The boy finally looked up, his face softening, but he said nothing. Instead, he stood up, the toddlers now stirring in their blankets, and moved toward the man with slow, deliberate steps. Henry observed this new arrival closely, his instincts kicking in once more. The boy had recognized him, but something wasn't right. The way the man moved, his urgency, it all seemed forced, almost too practiced. The man held out his arms, reaching for Mason and the toddlers, but the boy hesitated. There was no rush to embrace the stranger. He stood, looking at the man as if he were trying to understand whether this was really the person he should trust. Henry stepped forward, his voice firm yet calm. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping a careful eye on both the man and the boy. The man paused, then gave a nervous laugh, wiping his brow. I'm their father," he said quickly, but there was something in his eyes that made Henry's suspicion flare. The way he avoided making eye contact, the way his words seemed rehearsed, it didn't add up. "Where have you been?" Henry asked, his voice cool and steady. The man faltered for a moment, then shrugged. I'm sorry. I've just been looking for them. I'm sorry for the confusion. They got away from me, and I." Before he could finish his sentence, Mason finally spoke, his voice trembling, but full of clarity. "He's not my dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's lying." The room fell silent. The truth was out there, but no one was ready for it. The unfolding mystery. The tension in the station thickened. The man's face drained of color as Mason's words hung in the air like a sudden storm. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, echoing the uncomfortable silence in the room. Henry stood frozen, his gaze flicking from Mason to the man who had just claimed to be the father, and then back to Mason, whose quiet statement had shaken everything. The man's hand trembled slightly as he reached up to adjust his glasses, his eyes darting around the room. His lips pressed together in a thin line, and his posture seemed to shrink, the boldness he had arrived with rapidly fading into uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed like he might flee, but instead, he hesitated, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the floor. Mason, standing beside the toddlers, looked unwaveringly at the man. His face, usually soft with the vulnerability of a child, now wore a fierce, protective expression. His eyes were a mixture of anger and sadness, the kind of deep emotion Henry hadn't expected to see from a kid barely 13 years old. The boy's small hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set tightly. "Who are you, then?" Henry's voice was measured but firm. He wasn't letting this go. Something was seriously wrong, and he needed answers. The man looked up at Henry, his eyes wide with panic. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Then, after a long pause, he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice strained. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just here to take my kids home." But Mason shook his head, his face taut with frustration. "He's not my dad." The words were louder this time, tinged with a raw desperation that spoke volumes. He's the one who hurt them. I couldn't let him take them." Henry's eyes widened as he processed the boy's words. His mind flashed to the bruises he had spotted earlier, on the children's arms and legs, the signs of neglect, maybe even more. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. The man seemed to deflate, his facade slipping further. "I didn't hurt anyone," he mumbled, his voice now barely audible. But Henry could see it, the lie in his eyes, the way his body language betrayed his words. He was guilty of something, but of what? The story was still incomplete, and Henry needed to dig deeper. "Sir," Henry said, his voice calm but authoritative, "you're going to need to come with me. I'm placing you under suspicion of child endangerment. You're not leaving here until we figure out what's going on." The man's face turned crimson, and he stepped back, almost stumbling in his panic. "You can't do this. I'm their father." He raised his voice now, his hands shaking as he gestured helplessly. "I just want to take them home. What is this, some kind of joke?" Mason, however, didn't seem fazed by the man's outburst. He stepped forward, keeping the toddlers close to him, his body acting as a shield. It was clear now that Mason wasn't going to let the man near them. His gaze hardened as he met Henry's eyes, pleading for the officer to understand, to believe him. "Please," Mason whispered, his voice raw, "you don't know what he's capable of. He tried to take them from me. He doesn't care about them." Henry's heart sank as he took in the depth of Mason's words. The boy wasn't just protecting the toddlers from a stranger. This man wasn't a father, he wasn't a protector, he was a threat. Henry had seen enough cases of child abuse and neglect to recognize the signs, and the look in Mason's eyes confirmed that his instincts were right. Something darker lay at the heart of this situation. The man, realizing his attempts to convince Henry were falling flat, shifted uneasily, clearly torn between staying and fleeing. It was as if he was on the verge of doing something desperate, something violent, but he didn't act on it just yet. Henry took a deep breath, trying to keep the situation from escalating further. "I'm calling for backup," Henry said, his tone no nonsense. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." Before the man could react, another officer stepped into the room, Detective Sarah West, an experienced investigator with a sharp eye for details. She took one look at the scene, her gaze flicking between the tense atmosphere and the man, who was now fidgeting uncomfortably. "What's going on here, Henry?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but alert. "Get ready for a full investigation, Sarah," Henry replied, gesturing toward the man. "This guy claims to be the father, but Mason here says otherwise. We need to get him into custody." Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the man with an air of authority that made it clear she was in control now. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us," she said, her voice stern. "You're being detained for questioning." The man's eyes flashed with panic again, but he didn't try to run. Instead, he raised his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "I didn't do anything wrong," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not the one who—" But before he could finish his sentence, Mason cut him off, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and fear. "You're lying." The boy stepped forward, pointing accusingly at the man. "You tried to hurt them. You almost. The boy's voice faltered as he spoke, and for a moment, it seemed like he might collapse under the weight of his words. But then he regained his composure, his small body stiffening as he stepped even closer to the man, as though ready to confront him for everything that had happened. Henry felt a pang of sympathy for Mason. The boy had clearly endured more than anyone his age should have to. And yet, there he was, standing tall, protecting the children like a seasoned guardian, his innocence lost to a cruel world that had shown him nothing but pain. Detective West looked over at Henry, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'll handle the questioning, Henry. You stay with Mason." Henry nodded. He wasn't about to leave the boy alone, not after everything he had witnessed. He kept his eyes on the man, now being led away by officers, but his mind was on Mason. There was more to the boy's story, and Henry knew it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. After the man was escorted out, Henry sat down beside Mason, who hadn't moved since the confrontation. The toddlers were still asleep, their small faces peaceful despite the chaos that had unfolded around them. "Mason," Henry said softly, "I know it's hard. But you did the right thing. You protected them." Mason looked up at him, his eyes red from crying, but there was something else there now, a glimmer of trust. It was small, but it was there. He hadn't spoken much since they first met, but now, there was a shift. It was as if he understood that Henry was there to help, that he wasn't just another authority figure. For the first time since he'd arrived, Mason looked like he might finally feel safe. The boy nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't care about them. He only wanted them for himself. I couldn't let him take them away again. Henry's heart tightened. Mason was just a kid, yet he had carried such an enormous burden. And now, it seemed, he had finally found someone who believed him. Someone who would make sure that the children, and Mason, were safe. But even as Henry reassured him, he knew this was only the beginning. The real investigation was about to start. And the answers Mason had weren't going to be easy to hear. But they had to be uncovered, no matter how painful. Into the darkness. The rain hadn't stopped. It had been hours since the confrontation at the station, but the storm outside seemed as relentless as the mystery unfolding inside. The steady drip-drip of water against the windows punctuated the otherwise quiet room, where Henry and Detective West sat, their attention focused on Mason. The boy hadn't spoken much since the man had been taken away, but Henry had no intention of pushing him just yet. Sometimes, silence was more telling than words. Mason sat stiffly in the corner of the room, his eyes flickering between the window and the door, where the officers had gone to continue their questioning. The toddlers, now wrapped in blankets, had finally quieted and fallen into a deep sleep. They had been through so much in such a short time, and Henry couldn't help but wonder what had happened to them before they'd found their way to Mason. Detective West was going over the reports in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Henry," she said softly, not looking up from the papers. "This man, the one who claimed to be the father, he's not telling us the whole story. His identification checks out, but something's off. He's being evasive, and there's a nervousness there that doesn't add up." Henry leaned forward, his arms crossed as he regarded Mason from across the room. "I know. But Mason said something earlier that caught my attention, about the man trying to take them away. He's hiding something, but I don't think it's just about being their father. I don't think that's even who he really is. The detective nodded, her gaze still scanning the papers. I've asked for his full background check. But you're right. There's something more to this than we can see on the surface. I'm just not sure what it is yet. Henry glanced at Mason once more. The boy's expression had softened a little since the confrontation, but his eyes still held an intensity that made it clear he wasn't ready to talk yet, not without the right push. How's he holding up? Henry asked. Not great, Sarah said. He's been through a lot. His body language says it all. He's trying to keep it together, but there's a lot going on behind those eyes. Henry stood and walked over to Mason, pulling a chair next to him but not intruding on his space. He sat down slowly, allowing the boy time to adjust, knowing that pushing too hard would only make him retreat further. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, the gentle hum of the station filling the gap. After a long moment, Henry spoke, his voice quiet but firm. You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, Mason, he began, his tone reassuring. But if you do, I want you to know I'm listening. I'm here for you, kid. Mason shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of the chair. He avoided eye contact for a while, as if working through his own internal struggle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a shaky breath, his voice barely audible. I don't want to go back to him. He scares me. Mason's words were fragile, as if he were testing the waters, unsure of how they would be received. He said he was my dad, but I knew he wasn't. I knew at the moment he came for us. Henry leaned in slightly, keeping his voice calm and patient. Mason, you don't have to explain everything right now. But I need to know, what happened before you ended up on the street? Where were you and the twins before tonight? Mason's face tensed, and his fingers curled into tight fists in his lap. For a moment, Henry thought the boy wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We were in a place, a house. It wasn't a real home. It didn't feel like one. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected as much, but hearing Mason confirm it made the truth sink in even deeper. There was a dark undertone to the boy's words that suggested he had seen things no child should ever witness. Mason's gaze drifted to the sleeping toddlers, and his eyes softened for a brief moment. We weren't safe there. The man, he would leave us for days, sometimes. He'd come back and get angry, sometimes yelling, sometimes silent. He'd just watch us, like we were a problem. I hated it. Henry's heart ached at the description, the weight of it too much for anyone to bear, especially a child. Did he hurt you or the twins? Mason nodded slowly, the look on his face a mix of shame and fear. He didn't always hurt us with his hands, but it was worse sometimes. He'd lock us in the dark, leave us in a room and say we had to stay there until he got back. The twins, they're too young to remember, but they felt it, too. Henry felt a coldness settle in his chest as Mason's words reverberated in his mind. This wasn't just a case of neglect, this was something darker, something much more sinister. And the fact that the man had somehow convinced Mason that he was the father, that he had somehow gotten access to them, made Henry's stomach turn. Did anyone else know about this? Was there anyone else who tried to help? Henry asked, his voice a little more urgent now. Mason shook his head, his eyes avoiding Henry's. No. We didn't tell anyone. We couldn't. He said he'd take us away if we did. He always said people wouldn't believe us. He made sure we were too scared to say anything. The boy's words struck Henry like a punch to the gut. He had seen cases of manipulation before, but the way this man had instilled fear in Mason was beyond anything he had expected. He had to wonder how deep this web of lies and abuse went. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Detective West stepped in, her face tight with determination. "Henry, you need to hear this," she said quickly, walking over to the table and sitting down with a folder. "We've got some preliminary information on the man. His name's Richard Hayes. He's not actually a biological father, but he's listed as a foster guardian for Mason and the twins. The thing is, he hasn't been actively involved in their lives for months." Henry's mind raced as he processed the new information. A foster guardian? That was the piece of the puzzle he had been missing. But the questions were still piling up. Why had the children been left with someone who hadn't been involved in their care for so long? Where had Hayes been, and why did he show up now? What else do we know? Henry asked, his eyes not leaving the detective. West opened the folder and scanned through the papers quickly. Hayes was under investigation by Child Services a while back for neglect. There were reports of violent behavior, but they never pressed charges. The kids were never taken from him because they didn't have enough evidence. Henry clenched his jaw. So he wasn't just their foster guardian, he was part of a system that failed them. West nodded grimly. "It looks that way. But there's more. I'm getting reports of similar issues with other children in his care. He's been moving around a lot recently, renting homes, changing locations. This wasn't just a one-time incident. It's been happening for years." The weight of the situation was overwhelming. Henry could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. How many other children had been subjected to this man's cruelty? How many had suffered in silence, just like Mason and the twins? "We need to find him," Henry said, his voice firm with resolve. "We need to make sure he doesn't get away this time." As if on cue, a call came through to the station. West grabbed the phone, her expression hardening as she listened intently. She hung up the phone and looked back at Henry. "We've found him," she said. "But he's not going down without a fight." The chase and the truth. The storm had grown fiercer as the night wore on, the sound of heavy rain slapping against the station windows blending with the steady hum of the air conditioning. Henry stood at the edge of the room, looking out into the downpour, his mind racing. The information Sarah had just shared hit him like a tidal wave. Richard Hayes was far from the simple foster guardian he appeared to be. He had slipped through the cracks of the system, and now he was on the run. There was no telling how many children had been through his grasp, how many lives he'd ruined. But Henry wasn't going to let him get away this time. West's phone call had confirmed one terrifying detail: Hayes had a history of violence. Despite his non-threatening appearance, the man had built a reputation in certain circles, one that made Henry uneasy. And the way he'd looked at Mason, the way he had tried to claim the twins, it all spoke to something darker. This wasn't just about a case of foster neglect. This was personal. "We need to move fast," West said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to catch him. Hayes knows we're onto him. He's been in the system long enough to know how to cover his tracks." Henry turned to face her, his jaw clenched with determination. "What do we know about his last known whereabouts?" West shuffled through her notes. He was renting a property in a remote part of town, just outside the city limits. It's a secluded house, isolated. The kind of place someone might go to lay low. It's been vacant for the last few months, but I'm willing to bet he's there now. Henry didn't need to hear more. His instincts were already telling him what needed to be done. "Let's move. We'll head out there now, before he has a chance to disappear again." West nodded and picked up her radio, quickly relaying the details to the team. They would be moving out shortly. But Henry couldn't shake the thought of Mason and the twins still back at the station. They were safe for now, but Henry couldn't help but wonder what would happen if Hayes were to find them again, if the man would try to finish what he'd started. There was no time to waste. The drive to the property felt like it took forever, despite the urgency with which they moved. The rain had not let up, and the streets were slick with water, making every turn feel like a potential hazard. The headlights of the police cruiser cut through the darkened streets, illuminating only a few feet ahead of them as they made their way out of the city. The surrounding area grew more desolate, the houses sparse, and the trees heavier, as though nature itself was pushing them away from civilization. This wasn't the place anyone should be at night, but it was where Hayes had chosen to hide. When they finally arrived at the property, the house stood dark and silent in the middle of the woods, its windows like hollow eyes, staring out into the vast emptiness. The front door was locked, but the broken windows on the side suggested someone had been there recently. Henry's gut churned as he stepped out of the car, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We'll split up," West said, her voice low as they approached the house. "I'll take the back. You check the front." Henry nodded, his fingers tightening around the flashlight in his hand. They both knew the risks. If Hayes was inside, there was no telling what kind of reception they'd get. The man was clearly dangerous, and he had a lot to lose. Henry moved toward the front door, scanning the surroundings as he approached. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the sound of rain pounding against the roof was deafening. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he pressed his hand against the cold, weathered wood of the door. The door was unlocked, but he didn't push it open just yet. A shout rang out from the back of the house, cutting through the tension. Henry's heart skipped a beat as he rushed toward the sound, his feet splashing through puddles as he sprinted across the muddy yard. He reached the back just in time to see Sarah crouched behind a bush, signaling him with her hand. "He's inside," she whispered urgently. "I saw him through the window." Henry didn't hesitate. He gestured for Sarah to follow him and moved quickly toward the side of the house, looking for an opening. There was no time to waste. If Hayes was there, they needed to take him by surprise. They circled around the house, looking for an entrance. There was a broken window near the kitchen, and without exchanging a word, Henry slid through it, his heart racing as he landed softly on the other side. The room was dark, filled with the musty smell of old furniture and damp wood. Henry's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty shelves and cracked floorboards. But there was a faint noise, a shuffle, a rustle, coming from deeper within the house. He signaled to Sarah to move silently, and together they crept down the narrow hallway. The house felt like it had been abandoned for years, but there was something about it that felt eerily alive. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air thick with tension as they moved closer to where Hayes might be hiding. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the upstairs. Henry froze, his body instinctively going still as he listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, almost like someone trying to be careful, but failing. Hayes was upstairs, and Henry knew they couldn't waste any more time. Without another word, Henry started moving, heading toward the staircase at the end of the hallway. His hand tightened around his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as he ascended the stairs. Each step creaked beneath his weight, and he couldn't help but feel like the whole house was alive, watching him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw the faint outline of a figure through the cracked door of one of the bedrooms. The man was pacing, his back turned. Henry motioned for Sarah to stay back as he moved into position, ready to confront him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but there was no turning back now. Henry pushed the door open, and the light from his flashlight revealed Hayes standing near the window, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The man froze at the sight of the officers, his face paling instantly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Hayes made a move. He turned and lunged toward the dresser across the room, pulling something from the top drawer. Before Henry could react, Hayes fired a shot into the air, the deafening noise reverberating through the room. It was a warning shot, but it made Henry's heart race. He hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. "Don't move!" Henry shouted, his hand on his holster. But Hayes wasn't listening. He wasn't going down without a fight. Sarah moved in quickly, tackling Hayes to the floor before he could raise the weapon again. Henry rushed forward to help, and together they restrained him, his body writhing in an attempt to break free. "You don't understand," Hayes yelled as they cuffed him, his voice full of desperation. "I did what I had to do. It was the only way. They were mine." "Not anymore," Henry snapped. "You're going to answer for what you've done." With Hayes in custody, the immediate threat was over. But Henry knew this was far from the end. The truth about what had been happening in that house was just beginning to unfold. And the weight of everything, Mason, the twins, the years of abuse, would follow them all long after the case was closed. Unraveling the darkness. The air inside the police car felt oppressive, as if the weight of everything that had happened over the last 24 hours was pressing down on them all. Henry sat in the driver's seat, his knuckles white around the steering wheel as he watched the rain streak down the windows. The car's tires made a rhythmic hissing sound as they glided over the slick streets, but inside, there was a tense silence. Hayes sat in the back, his head down, handcuffed and defeated, the weight of the arrest pressing heavily on him. Yet, Henry couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the arrest wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. He glanced over at West, who sat beside him, her arms crossed as she stared straight ahead, her face set in grim determination. The exhaustion was evident in her eyes, but there was no time for rest. The investigation into Richard Hayes had only just begun, and they had barely scratched the surface of what had been happening in that house. As they approached the station, Henry's mind was racing. The immediate danger had been neutralized, but the details were still hazy. The more he thought about the way Hayes had acted when confronted, his frantic, almost panicked behavior, the more certain Henry became that there was something bigger going on here. Hayes hadn't just been a man who had taken a few kids in out of some misguided sense of care, he had been orchestrating something far darker. But what? The car came to a halt in front of the station, and Henry quickly turned off the engine. He reached for the door handle but paused, turning to West. "You think he's working alone?" West hesitated, her brow furrowing as she thought it over. "I don't think so. The way he was acting when we caught him, there's something more to it. He was trying too hard to cover his tracks. This wasn't just about the kids. He was protecting something, or someone." Henry nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. They'd only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. But what was lurking beneath the surface? As they entered the station, the officers were already preparing to process Hayes, but Henry and West knew they needed more. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. Henry turned to one of the officers on duty. "Make sure Hayes gets booked, but I need a quiet room for questioning. We need to get to the bottom of this," he instructed. They led Hayes to the interrogation room, the man walking with a defeated slump to his shoulders, his eyes glazed over with a sense of resignation. Henry could see the fear in his eyes now, fear of the unknown, fear of what they might uncover. But Henry wasn't sure if the man feared the police or something much more sinister. Once they were seated, Henry leaned forward, his eyes sharp as he studied Hayes. "You're not going to get away with this, Hayes," he began, his voice steady. "You're facing charges of child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. But that's just the beginning. We know you were involved in something much bigger than that. So, let's get it out in the open. What were you really doing with those kids?" At first, Hayes didn't respond. He just stared at the table, his fingers tapping nervously, as though he were calculating the risks of speaking. Henry pressed on. "You've been running a scam, haven't you? Moving children from place to place, pretending to care for them. You've been using them for something." Hayes slowly lifted his head, his gaze shifting to Henry. His lips trembled as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." West leaned in, her voice cold and direct. "Then help us understand. Tell us what's going on, or you can spend the next few years in prison. The choice is yours. For a long moment, Hayes sat there, his body rigid. He was weighing the consequences, trying to decide whether it was worth spilling his secrets or staying silent. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to go this way, he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to get so far. Henry's eyes narrowed. Get far? What do you mean? What were you really doing with the kids? Hayes clenched his fists, as if trying to steady himself. Then, almost as if the words were forced out of him, he spoke again. I was part of a ring, he said, his voice shaking. I wasn't supposed to be the one in charge. I wasn't even supposed to be keeping them, but I got too deep. I was supposed to be just the caretaker, just the middleman. I didn't know who else to turn to. They told me I was helping them find homes for the kids, but I was just a pawn. They promised me money, a fresh start, if I helped them get the children. Henry felt a chill creep down his spine. His instincts had been right. This was more than a case of child neglect. This was a human trafficking ring, something far more monstrous than they had first realized. Who? West demanded. Who was behind it? I can't say. I don't know, Hayes replied, his voice shaking with fear. I never met them in person. They contacted me online, gave me a list of children to look after. They provided all the paperwork, everything I needed to make it look legal. It was all fake. But the kids, those kids, I didn't mean to hurt them. I needed the money. I couldn't say no. Henry slammed his fist on the table, his frustration bubbling over. And what about Mason and the twins? Did you think you could just discard them like that? Do you know what you've put them through? I didn't mean for it to go this far, Hayes repeated, his voice weak. I thought I could get away with it. The kids, Mason and the twins, they were just supposed to be temporary. But I didn't realize how much trouble I was in until they started asking questions. I was so close to getting out of this. I just didn't know how to stop. Henry stood up, his anger boiling over. You've destroyed their lives. You've destroyed so many lives. You'll rot in here for a long time, Hayes. You're not getting away with this. As Henry turned to leave, West placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes hard as stone. We need to get those names. We need to bring down the whole network. If we don't, we're just scratching the surface. Henry nodded, his jaw tight. We'll get them. We'll find out who's behind all of this. Later that night, after Hayes was taken to holding, Henry sat at his desk, staring at the case file in front of him. The storm outside had finally begun to die down, but the storm inside him raged on. The facts were clear now. This wasn't just an isolated case. This was a network, a ring of predators, and they weren't done yet. If they wanted to stop them, they would need to move fast. But Henry knew there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and they were going to take down the whole operation. The lives of countless children were at stake. And for Henry, there was no going back from here. The final confrontation. The morning after the interrogation, Henry couldn't shake the cold sense of dread that clung to him. Even though Richard Hayes was now behind bars and the investigation was well underway, something about the entire situation still gnawed at him. The truth was horrifying: children trafficked under the guise of care, a network operating right under the authorities' noses, and the helpless victims who had been caught in the web of lies. The more Henry thought about it, the more disgusted he became. But there was something else, something deeper, that he couldn't ignore, the feeling that Hayes hadn't given them everything. Hayes had been scared, that much was clear. But what was it that had made him so terrified to reveal the full truth? What was he hiding? Sitting at his desk, Henry scrolled through the details they'd gathered so far. The information was starting to line up in pieces, but there were still gaps. West had been relentless in following up with all the leads, tracking down contacts, and cross-referencing everything they had on the operation. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more tangled the threads became. The people behind this operation were smart, far smarter than Henry had anticipated. They had been careful, methodical, and almost invisible. West walked into his office with a stack of new reports in her hands, her eyes tired but determined. She placed the reports down on his desk with a heavy sigh, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she leaned against the doorframe. "We've got a hit," she said. "Our tech team traced some of the online connections Hayes made to an encrypted server. The contacts weren't just for buying and selling children. There's more. There's a bigger player in this, someone we weren't expecting." Henry looked up, his heart rate quickening. "Who?" West paused, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "It's someone in the system, someone with power. A prominent name. A person who could easily make all of this disappear." "Who is it?" Henry's voice was sharp now, a sense of urgency in his tone. He was done playing games. This had gone on for too long. West hesitated, as if she wasn't entirely sure if the information would be too much to handle, but then she spoke, her voice low. "It's Daniel Covington. He's been working in child welfare for over 20 years. He's been the one reviewing the cases, assigning guardians, even approving adoptions. He's been at the heart of it all. He's a top player in the system, and no one has questioned his integrity." Henry's heart sank, the weight of the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. Daniel Covington, a man they had trusted, a man whose reputation was built on years of service and dedication to children, was at the center of this operation. "How could we have missed him?" Henry asked, his voice strained. "How could we not have seen it?" "We didn't have the full picture," West said, her tone more thoughtful now. "But now we do. He's been orchestrating this behind the scenes. Hayes was just a small part of the operation, a middleman. Covington is the mastermind, pulling all the strings." Henry's mind raced. Daniel Covington had always been highly regarded, a figure of authority, someone who seemed like he could never be associated with something so vile. His connections ran deep. He had influence in nearly every foster care agency and adoption center in the city. If Covington was behind all of this, it would explain why Hayes had been so afraid to speak up. "We need to bring him down," Henry said, his voice hard with resolve. "But we need to be careful. Covington won't go down without a fight. He's got too much power." West nodded in agreement, her eyes narrowed. "We need solid proof. Without it, we won't get a conviction. We need something concrete, something that will tie him directly to the operation. And we need it fast." The investigation had already uncovered so much, but they were still missing the final link to tie Covington to the trafficking ring. Henry could feel the clock ticking. Every minute they wasted could mean another child falling into the hands of the traffickers. They spent the next few days working tirelessly to build their case. Henry and West knew they were running out of time. They had tracked Covington's movements, followed his communications, and dug through every shred of evidence they had. But Covington was a seasoned professional. He knew how to cover his tracks. He had evaded detection for years, and it was clear that he wasn't going to go down easily. Then, just as they were about to lose hope, a break came in the form of a hidden server. It turned out that Covington had been using a secure digital channel to communicate with others involved in the trafficking ring. The server had been buried deep in the system, and it had taken days for their tech team to crack it. But once they had access, it was like opening a floodgate. On the server, they found everything. Documents detailing the false paperwork for the children, names, ages, backgrounds, all fabricated. There were also communications between Covington and several other key players in the operation, detailing the payments made for each child, the planned transfers, and even the locations where the children were sent. It was enough to bring Covington down, but they needed one more thing, proof that he had been directly involved in orchestrating the movement of children. Henry couldn't believe it when they found the final piece, a video. The video was grainy, but it clearly showed Daniel Covington in a meeting with other members of the trafficking ring. In the footage, he discussed the logistics of moving children between locations, including the exact details of how they would manipulate the foster care system to hide their operations. The chilling part was when Covington discussed the price of each child, how much he was making off each life that he destroyed. It was the smoking gun they needed. Henry sat in his office, watching the footage over and over again, his anger growing with each frame. He felt a burning rage at the betrayal, the cruelty of a man who had abused his power for years. Covington wasn't just a criminal, he was a monster. A monster who had fooled everyone, including Henry himself. "I think we've got him," West said quietly from the doorway, watching Henry as he stared at the screen. "This is it. We've got what we need." Henry's eyes met hers, and for the first time in days, a sense of relief washed over him. But it was fleeting. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. Covington would fight back, and this wasn't just about bringing him down, it was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. There was still a long road ahead, and many more children whose lives were still in danger. "We take him down tonight," Henry said, his voice filled with determination. "We don't let him slip away. We end this now." West nodded. "Let's go." It wasn't long before they were on the move. With the video evidence in hand, they raided Covington's office, his home, and the secure facilities where the children were being kept. The operation was swift, but Henry could feel the tension in the air. Covington knew they were coming. He had to. And sure enough, when they arrived at his office, he was nowhere to be found. "We're too late," Henry muttered, as they moved through the empty office, searching for any last shred of evidence. But just as they were about to give up, West found a final clue, a flash drive hidden behind a false panel in Covington's desk drawer. On it, there were more names, more details, and more information than they had anticipated. It was enough to prove that Covington was just the tip of the iceberg. Henry's heart raced as he realized the full scope of the operation they were up against. But with Covington's empire starting to crumble, he knew one thing for sure, they weren't done yet. The fight to protect these children was far from over, and they would have to dig deeper if they wanted to uncover the full extent of the corruption. "Let's bring him in," Henry said firmly. "We've got work to do."